Hi, everyone. My name is Barbra Dillon. I'm the editor-in-chief of Fanbase Press, and I'm honored to be here with a wonderfully talented group of panelists to do a WonderCon at Home panel entitled Uniting Schools, Libraries, and Independent Comics. Comic books, as you may know, are making their ways very much, especially now, into libraries and classrooms, and so they're providing new educational opportunities for readers of all ages. But with librarians and educators often facing financial limitations or ordering limitations in terms of the content that they bring into their spaces, often only mainstream publishers are forging a path into these venues. So today we're going to be talking a lot about where you can find very diverse and exciting new independent content, as well as how we can forge new paths together with comics, with libraries, and with educators for a more inclusive and educational forged audience, excuse me. So without further ado, though, I'd like to introduce each of our panelists. First, we have Dr. Katie Monnin, who is the first author to discuss teaching comics and graphic novels in 21st century classrooms. Alongside the award-winning Teaching Graphic Novels, she has also written 8 more books about teaching graphic novels and pop culture. And in 2018, Dr. Monnin created and launched WHY-SO Series Productions, an educational organization that creates curriculum and resource material for teaching pop culture literature in 21st century classrooms. Dr. Monnin, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Of course. We also have Moni Barrette, who is an administrative librarian and co-founder of Creators Assemble, board member at large for the American Library Association's Graphic Novel and Comics Roundtable, and mother of dragons. When she's not paneling at comic conventions, you can find her teaching her daughters to fight the patriarchy. A valid effort. Moni, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. We have Frederick Luis Aldama, who is the Distinguished University Professor at Ohio State University and Eisner and Latino Book Award-winning author of Latinx Superheroes in Mainstream Comics. He has served as the author, co-author, and editor of over 30 books, and he will soon make his picture book debut in the upcoming The Adventures of Chupacabra Charlie. Frederick, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. We also have Dr. Theresa Rojas, who is a professor of literature and language arts at Modesto Junior College, as well as a published author and artist. In her work in academia, Theresa teaches literature, creative writing, and composition, as well as comparative media, with a specialty in post-1945 comic studies and visual culture. She is also the founding director of the Latinx Comics Arts Festival. Theresa, thank you so much for being here. We also have Sebastian Kedlachek, who is a screenwriter, actor, and comic book creator. He is best known for the comic book series, Eisner-nominated comic book series, Quince, about a young Latina who gets superpowers on her quinceañera, as well as the action-adventure saga Penguins vs. Possums, about a secret interspecies war for dominion over the earth. Sebastian, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
And last but certainly not least, we have Henry Barajas, who is the Director of Operations at Top Cow Productions and the writer of VOZ DE M.A.Y.O, Tata Rambo, which was a Kickstarter success and later released through Image Comics. Thank you so much for being here, Henry.
Thank you.
Of course. So to get us kickstarted into the conversation, I'd love for the audience to get to know about each of you as individuals and how you came to work in your given field. So what inspired you to become librarians, educators, or creators, and how did this intersect with the sequential art medium? Dr. Monnin, why don't we start with you?
Oh, okay. So my story started on September 11th, 2001. I was a brand new teacher, first-year teacher in a junior high, and you know, that day changed the course of history in so many different ways, just like COVID is now, and we'll discuss that, I think, later. But anyways, my principal ran in and told me to click on the TV and talk to the kids about what was happening, and then she ran back out. And right when I turned on the TV, that second plane hit, and long story short, my class reacted in 2 ways. One, kids were crying, and the other kids thought it was a movie explosion, and they didn't understand what they were seeing visually. So during that moment in time, I thought, no one's teaching kids to read visually, and I really want to be a part of moving that forward. So then I went on to get my doctorate in graphic novel literacies.
Wonderful. And Dr. Rojas, what about you?
So I'm a professor right now in Modesto, but I started reading comics super early on, and I credit my mom with that. She was a huge reader in general, and she would buy me comics at the Rexall. I'm from San Francisco, and there was a Rexall on 16th and Mission. We'd go there often, and she'd buy me Casper, Richie Rich, and Archie comics. And so I was forever a big fan of Archie comics, but I kind of let that go for going into my adulthood, although I went to the occasional Star Trek convention. Not many people know about that, but now they do, I guess. But when I was in grad school at Ohio State, I had a mentor at the time, an advisor, who introduced me to Alison Bechdel's Fun Home, because I said to him, I really want to somehow bring together my interest in visual culture, autobiography, feminist theory. My master's is in feminism, and that's a weird thing to say. My master's is in feminism. You know,
It's impressive and amazing.
So I wanted to bring like these 5 different things in literature, of course, because I was in the English department, together. And this is David Herman said, I think you need to read Fun Home and the graphic memoir. And I was kind of like, you know, I'm in grad school, right? But at the same time, he, much like Frederick, who became my advisor later on at Ohio State, anything they say you kind of do because it's for your own good, even if you don't know it at the time. So I like to say that Alison Bechdel's Fun Home was my gateway drug / comic into this whole world of just fabulousness. And I was studying narrative theory at the time, and then bringing that together with Fun Home just opened up this whole world for me to study visual culture and literature, you know, at the same time. And then eventually when I wound up coming to Modesto for the position that I'm in now, I realized that students really respond well, much like what Katie was saying, that they respond so well to this visual storytelling. And in my particular college, when they see characters that look like them, they're just like, whoa, wait a minute. They're in stories and they actually visually look like us at the same time. So I wound up really evolving my choices of text for my courses into majority, for certain courses, into a majority comics. And that's been super, super successful. So that's the very short version of how I got here.
Wonderful. And Frederick, what about you?
Okay, so I've always wanted to publish books on comics, but I knew that if I did, coming out of graduate school, that I wouldn't get a job. So I published like 5 other kinds of books, and then I published my Your Brain on Latino Comics in 2009. And I mentioned that because now, and Teresa knows this, and I'm sure Katie and the others here also can see this happening. That's not so much a problem anymore. So I have now generations coming through, right? Even Dr. Rojas, you know, her dissertation was very kind of mixed media, et cetera. We can do that now. Couldn't do it in 2000, well, in 1999, 2000, when probably wouldn't have gotten tenure. But there's another side to this really quickly, which is that when I was, you know, doing all this stuff and meeting all of our comics creators like Sebastian and others, although it wasn't you, Sebastian, at that time, I realized that we needed, as you, Barbara, know, and Dylan, we needed venues for you all, because it just wasn't happening and it wasn't getting into the classrooms and we weren't getting your stories told and taught and all that good stuff. It was happening. You guys were doing the stuff. We were going to the Zine Fest and the Comics Fests and all that stuff. So I created Latino Graphics out of OSU Press. So it's a trade press series very specifically focused on Latinx creators of graphic fiction and nonfiction.
Wonderful. And Moni, what about you?
Regarding going into libraries, I actually was doing it part-time when I finished my undergrad. I was working in sales and marketing full-time, you know, paying the bills, hated it, worked in part-time in a library, totally fell in love. And then kind of as time went on, I ended up starting to push for, as I started to become more than a casual comics reader, push for getting more comics in libraries. And part of it was just a stubbornness of my wanting to change the way that the traditional library field kind of works, is just how slow things are to change and how necessary I feel that comics are. And so that was just sort of my entryway into getting the administration to allow me to start buying comics, and then getting those comics into the hands of our community, and then expanding that to getting onto the committee that made it the March the One Book One San Diego read through KPBS, and being able to see a lot of non-traditional comics readers start picking up graphic novels and realizing that they loved it. And then, you know, recently I ended up hosting Comic-Con book clubs, which grew so fast that we had to add a second one. So we became the first library to have 2 of those through Comic-Con International. And that brought in a whole nother community of just traditionally underserved adults to the libraries, and people who don't generally think to use libraries were now suddenly coming because of these book clubs, but also checking out our other collections. And the American Library Association's Graphic Novels and Comics Roundtable started 2 years ago, and I became involved in that, became a member at large on their first board, and that actually has proven to be their fastest growing roundtable in the 150-year history of ALA. So we knew we kind of had something there, but also, you know, not as many women in comics, not as many diverse backgrounds in comics. And so now finding myself jobless kind of in the middle of all this COVID stuff, as many people are experiencing, basically kind of, I had already started working on Creators Assemble as kind of a side thing. And now I am able to be flexible and pivot towards all the things that I know that libraries and educators need, and help kind of get those resources out into the hands of people in comics, to the hands of comic shops, and sort of bring it all together in a meaningful way.
Yeah. And Sebastian, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, I've loved comic books since I was a little kid. And the first thing that I ever can remember wanting to be is a comic book creator. In 3rd and 4th grade, started just drawing a ton, coming up with stories and universes, and so did my friends. And there was just something that was so special about it at that time, both the act of creating the comics, but also consuming comics so much at that time. It just really stuck with me. And even as through my life, I've veered towards, oh, I want to be a filmmaker, or I want to be this, or I want to be that. Comics have always been a constant for me in terms of, you know, I've always at least doodled or wanted to tell sequential art stories in one way or another. And even in filmmaking, I was like, oh, I love storyboarding because I'm like making a comic and then I get to see the comic come to life. So that's just always been something that's been so exciting to me and that I've been so passionate about. And then several years back when I came to LA, as many of us in creative fields do, like when you're waiting for something to happen, you start creating your own content or finding a different creative outlet. And I had met people that were really into comic books, same as I was. I had gotten a table at a comic book convention, was just going to show some artwork, maybe bring my portfolio. And we decided, hey, let's actually make a comic book. And so we did. We just did it. And that frightening moment of being behind the table and offering up your comic book to people that walk by until somebody doesn't walk by and they stop and are like, oh, what's this? That feeling was just so awesome. And to finally be on the other side of the table. I mean, I grew up in the Bay Area, so WonderCon was originally up there. And I loved going to WonderCon, and being on one side of the table and now to be on the other side is pretty amazing. So yeah, it was all just from a really deep love of comic books.
Yeah. And Henry, what about you?
What about me?
We want to know about you, Henry.
Oh, okay. Fine. So, I mean, I lost my job as a journalist, and it was pretty devastating. And I didn't write for a year, and my great-grandfather was admitted into the hospital. And I realized I didn't have much time with him left, and that my whole life I was told he did amazing things, and he had helped a lot of people, but no one really put that in context for me. So I picked him up from the hospital, took him home. My mom and I started asking him questions about what he did, and he just pulled out a folder of all the accomplishments he could prove. And I was going to start writing his biography, and then all of a sudden March comes out, and I realized that I've been in the comic book industry, but sidetracked journalism because I needed to eat and pay the rent. So now that that was gone, I needed to figure out a way to get back into comics and get back into what I love. So I started to research and develop the La VOZ DE M.A.Y.O, but the Rambo graphic novel that's out now. And aside from March being an inspiration, in high school, Art Spiegelman's Mouse was a big inspiration. My history teacher, who talked me out of joining the Marine Corps, was he, for the first time in my life, introduced a graphic novel into his curriculum, and I was more engaged than I ever been. And I always wanted to give back to that, and wanted to tell the story of my great-grandfather. And my journey into libraries is one of embarrassment. I was hosting How to Tell Latinx, people of color, LGBTQ stories, and even though if you're not that, because a lot of the times people would ask me about their stories, and if it was okay, like if I said yes, they then they finally had the permission they could use to tell a story that was outside of their reality and something that they could never understand or sympathize for. So I decided to host panels at conventions across the country, and I had all these amazing guests. And one day this angry librarian came up to me and said, "You didn't mention libraries." And I was like, "Yeah, you're right." And I never thought about it. And then I started to try to understand it, and it's been an amazing journey. And it's one of the best things that's ever happened to me, is an angry librarian yelling at me at a comic book convention. I think we all need that.
Yes. Well, I'm going to open up this question to the entire group. Many of you have worked in dual roles as creators, as educators, or advocates for tackling the applicability of inclusivity and representation within comics. So do you feel that these dual roles have influenced or impacted one another? And I'll open it up to the group, whoever would like to go first. Yes, Theresa.
So I never ever thought that I would be the director of a comics festival. It's not something that I was looking to do, but I mentioned my entryway into studying comics and then teaching comics. And for me, what happened was that I landed in a really special place. My division at Modesto Junior College, I have a dean who is very supportive in terms of, well, this is my idea for a thing that I want to do. And she's like, well, if you can make that happen, particularly if it serves our students. So before this, I was at MIT, which is a fabulous, wonderful, magical place, but they didn't need me at MIT the way they need me at MJC. My population is, the population of our students it wavers a little bit, but it's over half Latino, Latinx. And when I started bringing materials to them created by folks who look like them, right, who had similar experiences, backgrounds, who were from, California, from Mexico, from Latin America, they were just like, what is this? What is going on here? And what happened with me is that I invited one of my cartoonist friends who I met. It's all such a weird, circle, because I was invited to the Latino Comics Expo back in 2014 by Frederick Aldama to do an academic panel. I was on a panel, I did a presentation, and there I met a whole bunch of just fantastic Latino creators, and we got to be friends. So fast forward, 2017, 18, to Modesto, I invited Rafael Navarro up to do a public talk at the college on, what he does, do a drawing demonstration, come to my classes and talk about his work. And they didn't want to leave. Like the public talk, I had to kick people out of there. It was 9 o'clock at night. I'm like, go home. And I realized then that they were so hungry for this material, for comics generally, but then also for material that they could really connect with. And I invited the Latino Comics Expo folks up for us to work together. That was this past year. And then that led to me starting the Latinx Comic Arts Festival. So I'm like, what was I thinking? But it's phenomenal because now people are asking me about it, you know, and they're just like, when is this happening? How often? Can you do one every semester? I'm like, no, I cannot. But that tells me that it's not just about, you know, choosing text for my classroom. It's about people seeing themselves, but wanting to learn how to also become creators and tell their stories, the stories that they are not otherwise seeing.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else? Dr. Monnin,
I
what are your
can
thoughts?
piggyback off that a little bit. I think one of the things that Theresa is pointing out extremely well is that there's reading and writing, and they're always simultaneously occurring. And in education, we tend to teach reading a lot more than we tend to teach writing, unfortunately. So I think with comics and graphic novels, you have that visual right there, that the composition of visual rhetoric, and also the text. So one of the things, and I was a reluctant advocate of comics and graphic novels. I didn't grow up reading comics and graphic novels. I thought the first time I was handed Mouse, somebody said, you know, you're going to love this. And I was like, oh, and I took it home politely and put it on the shelf, and I was just going to return it. But it hit me on the head when I was cleaning, so I read it. Anyways, and right there, I realized that all of my English literature degrees, all of my writing degrees, added up to me missing a large piece of the puzzle, which was 21st century readers being so much more visual in nature, because we have all that research from Gunther Kress and the pedagogy of multiliteracies and all that stuff that happened in the 80s and 90s. And we even have Howard Gardner in the 80s and 83 with Frames of Mind saying multiple intelligences, verbal, linguistic, visual, spatial, need to be honored in the classroom. So that came to me slowly when a mouse hit me on the head.
Moni, what about you? You carry and wear many hats in your various roles.
Yeah, I mean, for me, libraries, especially in areas, Southern California, are very diverse populations. And I think for me, it kind of started again when I got that adult graphic novel collection into the library, and it was flying off the shelves. And before that, it was like, and this was traditional for libraries, like our highest circulating items were either DVDs, you know, for people to rent movies, or kids' books, which is all great, but our adult graphic novel collection became the third highest circulating item in the library, and really sort of like made me realize that we were onto something and we were serving in some way that, you know, was important. And I also saw a change in our homeless population. You know, there's a large demographic of that as well in the San Diego market, going from, and this is just anecdotal, but going from, you know, playing on the computer games all day long to reading comics, and like thanking us for having comics in a separate space where they didn't have to go into the teen area and feel like they were, you know, strange walking around in the teen area, to be able to get access to comics. And that led to us kind of starting to offer them online, and it just sort of skyrocketed, and that made me start reaching out to local educators, and educators were coming in and thanking us for having the titles available that were beyond the Marvel, the DC, you know, the indie titles available for them to start using in their classrooms. And, you know, not every library had the budget that we had to be able to do that, but we had a really great opportunity there.
Yeah. Well, Moni, you bring up a really great point about indie comics and indie titles. So given the title of our panel today, I felt that it would be best for us to define that so that we're all understanding what indie comics are, if those listening or watching may not be familiar. So I'm going to pose this first to Frederick. Can you tell us how you come to define independent comics or independent creators, and how do they differ from mainstream creators or mainstream titles?
Yeah, so you know, there's the big two. We kind of know DC, Marvel, and with Diamond kind of, you know, the kind of master controller of all of that content, getting into comic book stores traditionally, etc. If you weren't on board, in other words, if you didn't sell your soul and, you know, agree to like get a penny back on like, you know, $1 sold, if that, then you're, you know, looking for other ways to get your work out there. You're going to go independent. You're going to just make certain kinds of decisions, even creative decisions, right? Henry and Sebastian, you're going to be like, I want to be in total control over the narrative that's put out there. And I don't want anybody breathing down my neck. And the more kind of, it's like Hollywood, the more people involved, the more people's money's involved, the less like your product is going to be kind of entering the world. Indies, independents are right here. They're sitting with us, Sebastian, Henry, right? And finding spaces and finding publishers that will then help get their stories into the hands of librarians and school teachers and classrooms and so on. So yeah, most of our Latinx creators, that's them. Our LGBTQ plus creators, you know, that's, you know, our history. This is our history of publishing and getting our works, getting our voices in the ways that we want them to be heard and seen out to the public, to the readers.
Yeah. And for Henry and Sebastian, you've both straddled different types of independent comic creation in the fact that Henry, you have both self-published your work and gone through crowdfunding, as well as published through more traditional means with Diamond and Image. And Sebastian, you have both independently self-published and then published with a smaller publisher, being Fanbase Press. Do either of you want to add to anything that Frederick said regarding independent comics and independent creators?
Yeah, I mean, you know, a lot of independent creators start making their own stuff and then get the attention of Marvel and DC. And unfortunately, a lot of those creators are not people of color, they're not LGBTQ. And when these bigger publishers are looking for stories, they're looking for their idea of what a Latinx story is. So a lot of the times, you know, there's a lot of different journeys that we all come through. Some of us were born in Mexico, came here without without a say in the matter. Some of us were, you know, privileged to have family cross the border and have us here. And yeah, so I think a lot of I did my first Latino Comics Expo last year, and everyone kept saying, I just have to do it myself. It was like just something that kept coming up. I just have to do it myself, and I feel that, and that's definitely a spirit that a lot of, from at least what I've heard from a lot of Latinx creators, and I'm fortunate, and I recognize the privilege that I have, that I had to teach myself how to understand the library market, the comics direct market, the book market, and have to really diversify myself in the comic book industry, because you can't go to school for the weird stuff that I know. It's you know, I'm sure Sebastian could relate.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think that even in my, you know, from self-publishing to then going to a small press publisher, when you're self-publishing, you're doing everything. Like you're creating the comic, but then if you actually want people to see it, if you actually want people to experience it, you're putting in all this work that nobody ever sees. That it's, you know, whether it's from reaching out for interviews or signing up for conventions, or if you're putting your book on consignment at local comic book shops, whatever it is, there's a lot of work that just goes into that side of it. And just in my experience, moving from that to small press, that was a huge load off of my shoulders, because then you've got your press that's willing to do that. When you're looking at the mainstream comic publishing companies, I mean, they have teams of people, they have so many resources that independent creators just don't have. So in terms of getting your story out into the world, Frederick mentioned Diamond. I mean, if you're not on the Diamond train, at least up until now, if you're not on the Diamond train, then like all these people across the United States have no idea that you even exist. That's one thing that's great about award nominations, or about when libraries do find out about you, or when educators do find out about you, is that it really spreads the word of that story, and it really just amplifies in a way that you couldn't do on your own. Because yeah, I mean, unless you're plugged into those pipelines that the larger publishers have established, it's really hard to reach a large number of people with your story. And in terms of Latinx creators, or even just any independent creators, like, yeah, if you're gonna do a zine and go to Kinko's and copy it or whatever, like, you still get to tell your story. You get to still get your story put out into the world the way that you want it told, without, as I believe Frederick mentioned, with so many people invested in money and blah, blah, blah. And so it all gets pulled in a million different ways and watered down, and it becomes, as Henry said, somebody else's version of your story that's out there. And that's one thing that I think is so great about independent comic books, and why I hope more people will continue to discover these stories, is that they're so personal and they come from a really authentic place. And usually there are people that are looking for, like, oh, I need to put this out so that I can then move over to Marvel or DC or whatever. But there's also just a ton of people that are just like, look, I just want to tell my story any way that I can tell it. I just want to get this story out there. I want other people to see it. Like Theresa said, with students, where they can go, oh my gosh, that person is like me. Oh my gosh, my story is being told. I mean, that was a huge part of Quince, of the inspiration for Quince was, yeah, I wanted to tell a story that was based in my family's heritage and culture, and that showed that culture positively. But really, it was seeing my nieces and really registering, like, oh wow, there's such a limited representation, particularly in the superhero genre, but just across the board, you know, and to have those stories get out there and get amplified is amazing. I think that's so important in the educational space, in the library space. I mean, growing up, if we couldn't afford comic books, I would go to the library and get comics and just read a bunch of comics, and I could turn them back in, and it didn't cost me anything, you know. And I think that's so important, and it's such a useful and valuable tool.
Yeah. And one of the things that we're aiming to do with this panel today is to provide our viewers and our listeners with an opportunity to understand the various facets that go into comic book publishing, and that and also in readership and distribution. And part of that conversation is not only understanding, as Sebastian and Henry and Frederick were talking about, the demands on creators, but also the demands on educators, the demands on librarians, in addition to their day-to-day activities, just trying to educate people, to help their patrons. It can be challenging to find new content. And so one of the questions I wanted to pose to our educators, to our librarians, is how do you, in both balancing your efforts to just do day-to-day obligations, how do you find new content, and how do you balance your time in doing so? As understandably, I would imagine that's a limited time that you have to find new content, to find new titles. And Katie, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I write for Diamond, so one of the things they let me do often, very often and frequently, is choose the titles that I would like to write lesson plans and reviews about. So that's a really positive thing that they do. That's how I found Quince and some other things, a lot of other things. So yeah, I think also, what's the last part of the question again? Sorry.
No worries. How do you find new content that you're looking for? What are the platforms you choose?
Well, I ended up at a school, like a high school, so like I told you earlier. So I tend to listen to the kids and what they're interested in. And usually, I don't remember who said it, but it revolves around seeing themselves and seeing their own voices. And I think that's where the independent creators come in so helpfully, because they set the stage, whether or not the big two move on with that or not. They set the stage. The independent creators, for me, are the voice of the people in the comic and graphic novel world. They're putting out the stories that they're willing to take a risk on. They're willing to share. They want out there. They want to reflect all people, and different journeys and ways in which that works in the publication world. So yeah, that's how I listen to the kids a lot. And I also try to stay connected, I think, like everybody on here, with the Comic-Con circuit and what's going on there and different publishers.
And Moni, what about you?
It's hard in public libraries to find the time. There are just so many duties that a public librarian has. And, you know, our traditional review media, book lists, library journal, they're getting better of having lists that will get you through kind of the basic titles, but you really sort of have to get yourself dialed in, and that does take time. I can tell you from the other side of things, like if you want to reach out and get, there's a lot of buying power in libraries, both academic and public. And I think that as indie creators and publishers, you should look for, and the best probably place to find that would be the ALA's GNCRT at LibComics on Twitter, and reach out, because directly emailing, your newsletter, if you can afford to, not everybody can, but if you can send the first copy of, a copy of your work to the library, at very minimum, that will probably be added to the collection and seen by a lot of people in the community that wouldn't have normally gotten their hands on it. And at very best, if that library has the budget to do so, you will probably get, subsequent works of yours out into the world that way and paid for. So that would be my best advice. But yeah, it's difficult for librarians. You have to actively be looking for things like the LibComics. We have the recommended read lists, looking at every individual publisher. So I will have to say, with all the other duties, it is actually nice to receive, to sign up for the newsletters or have them sent directly to you. So keep spamming us, send us that stuff, because it's great, it's gold.
Yeah. Frederick, yes.
I just wanted to, and I think Dr. Rojas is doing this as well, but about 5 or 6 years ago, when I created SoulCon, the Brown and Black Comics Expo here in Columbus at The Ohio State University, I did it to bring our African American and our Latinx kids together, because we don't have opportunities like that for our kids to come together in spaces and realize actually there's a lot of commonalities. But I also wanted it to be a space for the school teachers and librarians, because all these all these creators, Henry and Dr. Rojas, who's also a creator, Sebastian, they're all like 40, 50 of them in a room with all their stuff. And, having librarians take an hour out and come and see like this stuff. And some of them even have a budget. I know especially the college librarians come with a budget and they fill their bags, right? So I think also like those spaces that we're creating for creators to be with the public should always be inclusive of our school teachers and our librarians.
Mm-hmm. And another question, Theresa, we'll actually come to you next, is that, and we talked about some of them, but what do you feel, both from the creator's perspective and then from the librarian and educator perspective, what are the barriers that you face in both finding new content in terms of independent comics or inclusive creators, and also as creators getting your content into libraries and educators? And Dr. Rojas, we'll start with you.
Yeah, that's actually the end of what I wanted to say, but I wanted to mention, certainly to piggyback on what Frederick was saying about SoulCon is an amazing convention. It's just to be in a room with so many incredible independent creators, and to be in that space where you get to have these, conversations, because it's not as gigantic a space where it's so noisy you can't hear one another. But to really get to see all of that work laid out, and then the kids that they bring, to see their little faces lighting up when you're talking about your work is very cool. And that reminds me of how I get new titles is through my students. That's one of the ways. I have an assignment for a particular sections of courses. When I teach composition, they have to do a comparative analysis as their final. And they have to go out and find texts. So they're constantly finding things that I have never heard of. And they'll bring them to me to kind of vet them. But I let them go crazy. And I have them do presentations. So they do a very short Pachachka style presentation. So it's that 6 minute, 40-second presentation. So they're presenting to everyone on whatever material they're covering. And then sometimes they'll donate the books at the end if they don't want to hang on to them. So I grow my library because my students are like, this was really cool. I want you to have it and give it to other students. And so I get to read all kinds of new material that way. And then I'm also very fortunate to have, many of the people on this panel today are friends of mine on social media, and I get to see what they're doing. And also, frankly, through Fanbase Press, I've met so many amazing people. I just don't know how you keep up with everything, Barbara. It is phenomenal. And I work also with my librarian, who's a magical unicorn of loveliness. And when I did the first comics event in Modesto, I said, is there any possible way that we could start like a mini library within the library, a micro library of Latinx titles? And she was like, sure, let me see, what I can do about funding. And she found the money for it. So now every year we're able to grow that collection. And my library's been amazing about growing their own comics and graphic novels. And the last thing I'll say is, and this is a big thing for me, is in terms of barriers, I have a really hard time when you cannot get a hold of a text. So let's say, you've created this new thing, but the only way that I can get a hold of it is if I go to a convention, or if I, I don't know, have some secret key or something, then I can't order it from my students. So I'm always trying to get creators to think of ways to, if not, publish and then make them available, do something like make it available through Amazon. So Amazon can do the printing, which I realize cuts into the profit quite a bit. But I want to mention, for example, a good friend of mine, Javier Hernandez, I teach his Days of the Dead, Volume 1, because he makes it so incredibly accessible. You can get it on Amazon, you can get it through him, and my library is able to get it, my bookstore is able to get it quite easily, ordering it in a couple of different ways. So that makes it easy for me to assign that book, because I know that I can put it in the hands of my students really easily. And I try to work with my librarian on, even if it's something like, we have zines in our collection, we have lots of independent stuff that's never been cataloged, and that's very exciting because they will do the cataloging. But we have to think of ways on the creator side of making it as easy as possible for folks to get a hold of our material, so that we can then use it in the classroom and have it in libraries.
Yeah. Anyone else, either from the creator perspective or from the librarian and educator perspective, any barriers that you experience day to day in accessing comics? Yes, Sebastian.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I think that's a great point, Theresa. And I mean, because I think, as you mentioned, Henry, so many of us don't think about that. Like, we just are making our stories and we hope people will get them. And we're used to going to comic book conventions, or we're used to going to comic book stores or whatever. So I think a lot of creators just don't even think about the accessibility of their work outside of them hawking it at a convention. So I think that panels like this are so important for creators to also become aware of things that they can do to help themselves and to help their audience reach that. Because I think in terms of barriers, there is a lot of like, you don't know what you don't know. You may not even, if you're thinking about libraries, you may not even know where to begin, or like, oh, that's something that's actually inaccessible to me, so I'll focus on something else, because you don't know where to start, or you don't have like, an entire team like Marvel or DC would have, like, oh, here's all our educational comic books, here you go, So I think that it's things like this, and keeping that dialogue going between creators and librarians and educators is so wonderful and positive, so that you kind of see what your blind spots are, and you start thinking about things in different ways. So I think that's one barrier that can maybe come down. So I think that's great.
I wanted to go ahead and jump in on some barriers that kind of haven't been mentioned, that from the library perspective. And that would be, there's a lot of gatekeeping still in libraries. These are bureaucracies, for better or worse. They're tied to, city and county entities. And there's also a lot of kind of old school mentality at the top, and obviously budget barriers and that kind of thing. So I just wanted to say too, is again, if you're able, if you're in a position where you can donate something to your library, that is a good way to help overcome those things. Please be patient with your librarians and with your teachers, because often you are approaching a frontline librarian and they're having to work with their administration on, can we even have comics in our library? And if so, where would we catalog them? What would the signage look like? What formats should we have? What happens if we can't afford to buy after the first issue? Then how do we serve our patrons? There are a lot of factors involved in having any item in a library, and comics would be on that list. So just kind of be aware and be patient, and wherever you can, come with something that is easy to catalog. It's, you know, zines and things like that are great, but physically it's very difficult to be able to handle those. If you have an online format for those things, that's great too. So yeah, those are the things that I want to say before I put myself on mute, because my child.
No worries. That's a wonderful point, Moni. Well received. And before, we have only a few minutes left, sadly. I wish I could talk to you for another hour, but before we go to each of you to offer our listeners and viewers where they can find your work, where they can find more of your thoughts and websites, are there examples either of platforms for independent comics, publishers, or specific works that you have really found to be positive examples of inclusive and representative independent comics that you have either integrated into your classrooms, integrated into your libraries, or that you just want to give a shout out to? Henry, we'll start with you.
I always, I mean, I remember learning about Frederick's Latinx anthology and being upset that I didn't get a chance to get into it. And I remember asking Gonzo, like, what's up with this guy? Like, he just acts like he owns the joint. And he was like, no, he's cool. And he was. And so, yeah, his Latinx anthology is an amazing series. And I always just like to point to March. I think it changed, and I know personally, it changed my life. And I would not have been able to tell the story, or I mean, at the time, I'm sure I would have figured it out, but it was just such a huge inspiration to me. And I think that was such an exciting moment in comic book history. Just having him at the Eisners and just really being a presence there. But yeah, I mean, at this point right now, I'm very, very grateful that my publisher, Image Comics, has my comic on Hoopla right now, and folks can go on Hoopla and read my book, and if they can't afford to buy it on Amazon or literally any digital retailer. So ask your librarians, like Moni said previously, be patient with them, and they want to help, and they will do whatever they can to lift your voice up above a certain degree, and whatever that degree is a better degree than where you first started. But I think the Black and Brown Comics Expo in San Francisco is a great place to get stuff. There's so many different creators there in the Silicon Valley area and Oakland, and I have yet to go to SoulCon, so I'm really excited for that. But just check out Twitter and check out Instagram. There's so many new Instagram comics coming out. It's a good time right now. Unfortunately, the market and the economy and the world is in a place where you have to go direct to consumer, but I hope eventually we'll be able to be in some sort of place of normalcy where we can browse again.
Absolutely. Dr. Monnin, what about you?
If I had to share a certain title that changed me probably in the last 2 years in terms of representation, and even from my perspective, I should have known a lot more about the topic than I did, but was Maya Kobabe's Genderqueer. That was an amazing delivery. It was effective. I would love to teach it someday. I think part of our earlier conversation about boundaries, for me, it's sometimes parents and administrators at the school. So I do a lot of writing those letters that explain, here's the history of comics, here's why it matters now, and here's the people who are doing it, and validating that process. But I would definitely say Maya Kobabe's Genderqueer was the most prolific one in my mind in the last year.
I co-sign.
Frederick, what about you?
So yes, so this Tales from, does this even appear?
Oh,
yes.
There it is, yes.
From La Vida, a Latinx comics anthology. And Henry, I'm so sorry, and Sebastian, that you aren't there, but maybe I'll be able to do volume number 2, and you guys will be right there at the beginning. But yeah, that one, you can come see all my scholarship, the Latino graphic series that I have, all of that stuff, if you just go to Professor Latinx at osu.edu. And yeah, that's everything's kind of there, including well, everything. And my book, The Adventures of Chupacabra Charlie, drops in June. And I partnered with a comics creator, illustrator, Chris Escobar, on that. So even though it's a kid's book, it's very, comic book-like. And it's also through my Latino graphic series with OSU Press. And Quince, I love the bilingual, the scholarly kind of education sort of way that's in the world. And I think it's a game changer for us as educators. I think it's a game changer for teachers in the classroom and for future generations of educators. So it will be assigned in all of my classes for sure.
That's very kind, Frederick. Sebastian, what about you?
Wow, I'm almost speechless when I asked, but thank you so much. And I think that in terms of recommending titles, I mean, VOZ DE M.A.Y.O, everything from Frederick. I actually was able to read Chupacabra Charlie. It was super fun. I really enjoyed it. So I'm looking forward to having a physical copy of that in the future. I've also, I think through Quince, I've been exposed to so many sort of online communities where I've discovered titles that maybe I wouldn't have known of before. So I think that I would just encourage everyone to really dig in and to find those things online as well. If you can't make it out to a convention, or if the creators have not yet listened to this panel and don't realize they're supposed to reach out to librarians and educators, I think there's a lot of great resources online and community groups and whatnot. And then I'm sorry, I just wanted to say, there's a couple of people on this panel that have contributed to making the bilingual edition of Quince so great. And I just wanted to, again, acknowledge them and thank them. And I think that we really put a lot of work into that hardcover, and we're very excited about it.
Definitely. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Rojas, what about you?
So I wanted to mention, first of all, I had an amazing time doing the study guide for Quince. So everybody should read Quince, the definitive bilingual edition, which is phenomenal. One of my colleagues in Spanish is thinking about teaching that. I gifted her a copy for her birthday, and she was just blown away by the possibilities there. A couple of things that I'm reading that I wanted to shout out. Mashbone and Grifty is super fun, super smart. It looks like it's going to be dumb, and it is, but in a super smart, funny way. And that's Garza and Esquivel who are working on that. Oscar Garza and Rolando Esquivel. I absolutely love the Mashbone and Grifty series. And I'm reading Under the Cottonwood Tree that just came out. I love getting these things in the mail when you support the Kickstarter and whatnot, right? So I got that, and it's so just gorgeous to open it up and see that there's, one of the first images, I'm looking at it now, is someone reading stories to a group of children. So this is beautiful folklore, fairy tale type book. And of course, if you go to the Latinx comicartsfest.com, I will work on getting more content up there. But we are launching our virtual series on Saturday. We have 5 panels coming up. Everything from indie creators, how to do it all, to the superheroes and different ways of looking at and thinking about superheroes. And I tried to put my Instagram, but it got cut off. But it's Doc Tero, DOCTEEROH. So you can follow me there.
Wonderful. Before we sign off, we have but a moment or two left, but I want to ensure time for each of you, as Dr. Rojas did, share where our listeners and viewers can find you. Dr. Rojas, anything else that you'd like to add about where we can find you online?
Here, let me clarify that. There we go, right there.
Perfect. Excellent.
I have. So right there, that's where I share things that I'm working on. Most recently, things that I've been cooking during the quarantine, but I'm trying to knock that off. More art things, but that's like my creator space.
Wonderful. And Dr. Monnin, what about you?
Upcoming this year, Why So Serious Productions will have a podcast and hopefully a YouTube channel by the end of the year talking about similar things that we've talked about on this panel. Also, I write for Diamond, and I also write for DC for their educational teaching guide. So you can find me out of those places.
Excellent. And Sebastian?
I would just direct you to quincecomic.com or fanbasepress.com. That's where my heart's at.
Excellent. Frederick?
ProfessorLatinx.osu.edu. Everything's there.
Excellent. And Henry?
You can find me, just type up my name, Henry Barajas. I'm on the Image Comics website, Top Cow website, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. Yeah, I'm all over the place and I'm really easy to get a hold of these days.
Excellent. And Moni?
You can find me several places at Lib Comics, which is COMIX on Twitter, is where you'll find the ALA work. Creepin_it. I do a true crime and horror podcast for the last 3 years. So, and then obviously creatorsassemble.com and .org and .net. So
Wonderful. Well, again, a brief thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you so much for sharing your time and your efforts and just all of your hard work and advocacy throughout the year. It is immensely appreciated by creators all over the country, all over the world. So thank you for all that you do. Again, my name is Barbra Dillon. Thank you for joining us. I hope that you have a safe rest of your week and be healthy, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.